Sarah Zacharine. I'm an XPS staff scientist at PHI, and today I'm going to be sharing this talk on surface analysis of platinum nickel and platinum nickel cobalt nanowires for improved electrocatalytic properties. So this topic kind of falls under the overall umbrella of the concept of the hydrogen economy, which aims to build an energy economy around hydrogen. And hydrogen can be used for a wide variety of applications, as well as turned into electricity and then fed back into the electric grid. But we need essentially new technologies to make sure that the production of this hydrogen is clean, as well as the storage and utilization, as well as meeting cost targets and still performing with high functionality. And this requires a variety of different devices in order to be able to produce, store, and utilize this hydrogen gas effectively. So there are a couple different devices that we're going to be talking about, which are polymer electrolyte membrane or PEM devices. There are electrolyzers which generate hydrogen from water, and PEM fuel cells which use that hydrogen to generate electricity. And the benefits of these devices are that they have no emissions, so they're able to produce either the hydrogen or electricity fairly cleanly. They're high energy density devices. They can also operate at low temperatures, which makes them more easily suitable for a variety of applications. They can be used in automotive applications such as cars, trucks, and trains, as well as a variety of stationary and portable applications. And they can be used in tandem, again, using water to generate hydrogen, and then the hydrogen to generate electricity, kind of in this full closed loop cycle to turn water into electricity in a fairly clean and high performing cycle. However, in the fuel cells specifically, which we'll be focusing on today, the oxygen reduction reaction at the device cathode has very slow kinetics. And this is kind of a big area of research is catalyzing this reaction more effectively. Typically platinum is used, but this is an expensive metal. So there's an active area of research in this field aiming to use lower platinum content catalysts that still have really high activity and durability for long device lifetimes. So when we think about the ideal properties that we want in this type of catalyst, again, as I mentioned, of course, we want high activity, we want a high performing catalyst. Platinum is considered the most active metal towards this reaction. And if we look at this plot on the top right, this is looking at the oxygen binding strength of a variety of different metals. This is colloquially known as a volcano plot due to its shape. And you can see platinum is the closest metal towards the peak, which is why it's commonly used. However, it's not quite at the peak. So we can optimize the performance of the platinum slightly more by doing a few different things. And one of the ways to do that is to create an alloy with a different metal or kind of a core shell structure. So this will use slightly less platinum, but it will also improve the activity of the platinum itself because it will alter the platinum D band. And there's a variety of metals that you can use as the secondary alloy material. However, sometimes this other transition metal can leach out of the catalyst during operation of the fuel cell, and it can contaminate the cell and harm long-term performance. Defects can also be used to tune the performance of these catalysts by inducing local strain in the platinum metal through things like vacancies or grain boundaries. This can be used to improve performance, but it's kind of a trade-off that can have mixed effects if it's not incorporated in an optimal way. And then, of course, we also want high stability. So nanoscale catalysts such as nanoparticles are generally known for having very high activity. However, they can have some durability concerns like agglomeration or Oswald ripening and a variety of other different mechanisms. Bulk materials are generally considered slightly more stable over the long term, but they can have a lower surface area and other trade-offs. So a new area of catalyst was introduced called the nanostructured thin film, which is essentially an extended surface catalyst where you can have high specific activity, high surface areas across a substrate, but still have slightly better durability of more bulk scale type materials. And in this work specifically, we're using this concept to create extended surface nanowire structures. One of the sample sets is using platinum on a nickel nanowire, and the other one is using the bimetallic deposition of platinum and nickel on a cobalt nanowire to see how the overall platinum nickel composition can be tuned differently with these two different processes. And these metals were deposited by atomic layer deposition, or ALD, which has pretty high control over creating thin metallic layers, even on this kind of more challenging type of substrate. And these were treated with a couple of different post-processing steps, including annealing to develop an alloy to improve the activity of the platinum, as well as kind of a pre-leaching step to pull out some of that excess transition metal to achieve better durability. So throughout this talk, we're going to be kind of talking about these two different sample sets and the different post-processing steps that were used to improve both activity and durability for these types of applications. So there's a variety of questions that we have about these materials. One, we want to know, are the wires homogeneous in size, shape, and morphology? What do they look like to start with? And how does that those properties change with processing? Do we actually get that nice core shell structure with the coating on the nanowire core? And does the ALD coating actually deposit uniformly across the nanowires? What does that look like kind of on individual wires versus multiple wires? Do we actually develop the alloy between the platinum and nickel or platinum and cobalt? We also want to know what chemistries are present for these different metals, platinum, nickel, and cobalt. And do the post-processing treatment steps change any of these properties, both the distribution of the metals, the morphology of the wires, and the chemistry of the metals? We also want to know what kind of surface contamination we have. Does this change with post-processing, because that could ultimately have impacts on integration into the cell? And then do the nanowires remain intact, especially through some of these acid leaching steps, which can be quite damaging to the structure? In order to answer all these questions, we're going to be using a few different techniques. So at physical electronics, we have three main instrument families: Auger electron spectroscopy, or AES, TOF-SIMS, which is time of flight secondary ion mass spectrometry, and XPS, or X-ray photoelectron spectroscopy. And this is kind of a plot of the detection limit versus the analytical spot size. So we have a couple of techniques that are kind of focusing on a broad range of different trade-offs. So Auger generally is used for very high spatial resolution imaging and mapping of morphology and elements. XPS can also provide short-range chemical information, certain bonding types, and looking at different oxidation states, as well as excellent quantification without the use of standards needed. And TOF-SIMS is the most surface-sensitive technique of these techniques, and it also has a really good detection limit in the parts per million or billion range, as well as the ability to get more information about molecular organic species that are present. So we're going to be showing you today how each of these techniques can be used to provide complementary information to get kind of a more full understanding of this type of sample set. And we're going to start with Auger. On our Phi 710 system, this is a schematic of our electron gun and energy analyzer, which is coaxial. So this means that we have line of sight onto your sample. Our electron gun is coming directly from the top, normal to the sample, and then our analyzer is also normal to the sample. And this also gives us the ability to analyze rough samples because we will have much less shadowing. So this is very suitable for something like a nanowire or a particle. In this example, we have an image and a map of particles, and you can see we're going to be getting electrons coming off at all sides of the particle. Because of this geometry of our system, we can analyze those more effectively and get a much nicer image and map compared to a non-coaxial geometry where you can see we have a lot of shadowing because you're not detecting a lot of the electrons coming off on the opposite side. So with this setup, we can get high spatial resolution SEM images, which can be used to look at morphology, find areas of interest, as well as Auger analysis, both spectroscopy and mapping of elements with high spatial resolution to look at the composition across the sample. So we started by looking at some large field of view images of these nanowires, and we noticed a few things right away. We can see, even from kind of zoomed out, that there are a lot of different types of wires present. And if we zoom in a little bit, you can see this even more. We have some wires like this one that are very long, so we have differing lengths of the nanowires. We have some different morphology. Generally, they're pretty globular looking, especially this one. There's a couple that are much more globular looking. And there's also a variety of lengths, diameters, and sizes of these wires. So we have kind of a heterogeneous size and morphology distribution of these wires to start with. We can then look at some spectroscopy to see what elements are present here. And we see our platinum coming from, again, the ALD coating, and nickel, which is the nickel nanowire template. As we would expect, we see a nice signal for both of these elements. We also notice that there's some carbon and oxygen present, which could be due to surface contamination. And we will be able to investigate some of those species in a little bit more detail with TOF-SIMS, but we can already see these kind of clearly at the sample surface with this initial Auger spectrum as well. And here's another image of slightly more zoomed in of some individual wires. And then we're also going to use this to map the platinum, which is again the surface coating, and then the nickel. And another thing we noticed from this, the fact that we are detecting that nickel, which again is coming from that core wire, we either might have some movement of the two metals, a diffusion, and or the platinum coating is thin enough that we're able to actually detect through it into some of that bulk nickel structure. So now we're going to go through and show some data for this full platinum nickel nanowire sample set, starting with this as synthesized material. So this again was using atomic layer deposition, or ALD, to deposit thin layers of platinum onto the nickel nanowires. So after the synthesis, this is one example of the wires we looked at. Like you saw in some of that smaller field of view image, we have a wide variety of diameters and lengths of these nanowires, but generally they are pretty intact. They're pretty smooth looking. We have kind of long lengths of wires, so they seem to have this more intact morphology. After annealing, we retain a lot of that structure. We start to see there's some textural differences on some of these different wires. Some of them are slightly more smooth. Some of them have a little bit of roughness on these wires. And this annealing process was again done to alloy the platinum with the nickel metal. So this was done in hydrogen at 250 degrees C for 2 hours. So we're going to be looking a little bit more at the chemistry implications of that in a bit. And then these were acid leached. So again, the goal of this was to pull out a bunch of that bulk nickel core before these are incorporated into a cell, because otherwise that will happen during fuel cell operation, which can lead to degradation of the cell over time. And we see that in fact they are quite hollow. They're very thin looking. We also notice that some of them have broken up. Generally, they look like there are shorter pieces compared to the synthesized and annealed samples. However, we see that they're also intact, so they're not completely falling apart after this acid treatment. We still retain some of this nanowire shape and dimension, which is what we want in order for these to perform. After reannealing, again, they're still hollow. We see it looks slightly more smooth in certain areas, and generally we still see this nice wire structure. And this reannealing step was aiming to use the hollow structure for durability, but also regain some of that platinum nickel alloy, which again, we're going to talk about a little bit later. But generally, the good news is these remain intact. We still see some of that nice morphology and structure even after all of these different processing steps. So next we used Auger spectroscopy to map the nickel and platinum distribution for these 4 different samples and compare this to the SEM images on the top. So the sampling depth of nickel and platinum with this technique is about 1 to 3 nanometers. So again, the fact that we're seeing nickel means either we're kind of probing through the platinum layer and or we might have movement of the different metals happening with these different treatment steps. We see generally a pretty even distribution of platinum and nickel. There are again a few different wires present. We see this nice morphology present, but generally they're fairly uniform. We see a slight difference in signal amounts with these different treatment steps, and once they're acid leached particularly, these maps look a little bit different compared to the other ones. Generally, the platinum looks a little bit lower intensity, which you would expect since that's very thin at the surface. And then after this reannealing step, we see some changes overall, but generally they look fairly uniform, but because we have the small beam size with this technique, we wanted to analyze this a little bit further, more quantitatively, and see how uniform that chemistry really was. So this is one example of a nickel map on the left, platinum map on the right, where we are analyzing numerous different areas and looking generally at the composition here. And we do see that there are some differences. So in these two areas, which appear slightly brighter on the nickel map compared to these other wire areas, we do see that there is a higher nickel amount in those areas. In the platinum map, this area appears slightly brighter, and in fact, that is a more high platinum containing area as well. These other areas kind of on this larger wire in the center have more of an average blend of nickel and platinum detected in those regions. And then there was this one area that had specifically higher carbon amounts as well. So again, the map's generally uniform, but we do definitely see some differences, and the ability to actually look at heterogeneity of these elements on one individual wire is one of the really nice benefits of this technique due to its very small analytical spot size and high spatial resolution. So next, we're going to look a bit more at TOF-SIMS. So generally in TOF-SIMS, imaging a rough sample can be challenging. And if we look at this example of these extraction field lines on the top right, this is kind of a particle, or you could imagine potentially looking kind of down the nanowire tube. You're going to have ions coming off not only normal to your analyzer, but all of the edges as well, similar to what we talked about with the SEM. And this means that these ions will be leaving the sample kind of at different angles and essentially hitting the detector at slightly different times, which can decrease the mass resolution of our signal. However, on Phi TOF systems, we have a unique analyzer design, which is the TRIFT analyzer, which stands for triple focusing time of flight. And if you look at the schematic here, the black line is representing that kind of more normal ion path, but again, in this type of topographic sample, we're going to have ions coming off on the edges. This unique triple electrostatic lens focusing means that our ions will actually be compensated to reach the detector at a similar time and compensate for that wide angle of acceptance. So this allows us to analyze these types of rough samples with higher mass resolution. And the TOF-SIMS technique generally has a very high spatial resolution as well as really nice detection limit on the ppm ppb scale. So the ability to kind of analyze these rough samples with all of these benefits is very suitable for this type of nanowire structure. So again, we're looking at this platinum nickel nanowire to start with, and we can also use this technique because it has trace level detection and it can look at more organic type molecular species. We're able to look a little bit more closely at the type of surface contamination we have present. So this is looking at one example of these nanowires after synthesis, starting with sodium. We see a little bit of this tracking with certain nanowire type features. However, we also see that there's more globular presence that's kind of different from the nanowire structure. If we compare this to the chlorine contamination, this tracks more consistently with the nanowire shape across the field of view, which suggests that this is kind of more cohesive on the wires themselves. And we also notice that the sodium and chlorine maps are not completely aligned, so they look slightly different, which means that this is probably not present as a sodium chloride. If we look at the bottom row of this potassium and amine contaminants, we see that this tracks even less so with that wire shape, and it's really more kind of clumpy and dispersed kind of heterogeneously. So this suggests that these are likely more an external contamination and not necessarily something that is on the wires themselves. Now that we've seen that there are a lot of different surface contaminants, we have the ability to sputter clean these samples using the argon gas cluster ion beam, which is very effective at removing organic species without damaging the metals, in this case, the platinum and nickel. So we also were able to map the platinum and nickel distribution in these wires. The platinum signal is quite low compared to the nickel. We see the nickel is really present kind of throughout on all of these individual wires. Again, it's a bulk nickel nanowire template, and the platinum is really more of a thin surface layer, but the platinum also has a slightly lower ion yield, so that is leading to the lower signal. We do see that it looks like platinum is appearing kind of brighter in certain areas, and if we look back at the chlorine map that I showed you on the previous slide, we see some kind of corresponding bright spots. So it might be that these were kind of more in focus in these wires, but generally the platinum we see a little bit tracking with that wire structure. It's just a fairly low signal. So next we're going to look at the nanowires that were a cobalt nanowire coated with bimetallic platinum and nickel ALD deposition, because again, this can change the resulting platinum and nickel chemistry that's present after all these different processing steps. So here we're starting with looking at the surface contaminants again. In the top left, I just included these maps showing where the nanowires are located versus the indium foil, so that you can look at the corresponding contaminants and how those track with the two different regions. So starting again with sodium, we see there's a really high concentration of sodium more present on the indium foil substrate. But we do see that there's still sodium present on the wires, and kind of similar to the platinum nickel set, we see in some cases it tracks with the wires, and in other cases it does not, and it's kind of more clustered. If we look at the potassium by comparison, this is almost exclusively present on the indium foil, and this more organic carbon-based species is kind of present throughout. In this sample set, we also had some nitrate-containing species, which track more consistently with the nanowire area, as well as the nanowire kind of positions, which again could mean that this is more present on the nanowire samples themselves. And in this sample set, we also imaged the nickel and cobalt and collected these elemental maps. We see again that the cobalt is present in kind of clear amounts throughout all of the nanowire features. You can see some of those nanowire structures quite clearly. With the nickel, however, this is not really looking like the nanowire shape. It's more clumpy. It's kind of segregated in certain regions. So this indicates that this, again, in this case, the nickel is the coating on the nanowire template. And this indicates that here, this nickel coating does not look like it's very uniform across the majority of the cobalt nanowires. And you can see that in particular in this overlay of these two elemental maps. We see clear regions with brighter nickel and some without much nickel, and it's not really tracking very uniformly across the wires. So comparing this back to a few slides previous, the platinum map was also fairly low concentration, but it generally looked a little bit more uniform as a coating on the nickel nanowires than this nickel does as a coating on these cobalt nanowires. So finally, we're going to start looking at some XPS and HAXPES results. So on the Genesis, both our XPS and HAXPES sources are focused scanning X-ray microprobes. So this means that we have a kind of a small controlled focused beam size that scans across the surface. This also allows us to kind of navigate similar to an SEM, where you can click and drive and use that scanning image, as well as save an image and correlate your spectroscopy to that. Our XPS chemical sensitivity is more surface sensitive, but this is up to 10 nanometers, and then the chromium is probing about 3 times that, so about up to 30 nanometers. So this is the deepest analysis out of these surface analysis techniques that we've talked about. And these can also be used to look at atomic concentrations of both elements as well as chemical states. So first, this is one example of some imaging that we did on these nanowires. We collected this kind of large scale image with our SXI imaging to do more of a mosaic across a wide sample surface. And the bright area is the nanowire powder on the kind of substrate material. So this can simply be used for navigation, just to make sure that we're actually analyzing on an area with really high coverage. So we're not looking at the tape or the foil that it's mounted on. But we can also use this to navigate to individual wires. So we can see a couple wire-like shapes, especially kind of at the edges of these thicker powder clusters, we see this nanowire shape show up in certain areas, and this is kind of one nanowire that's slightly bent. So in this case, we are using this imaging to kind of find areas of interest, but because we have this microfocused X-ray beam, you can also collect data from individual wires, especially on the cobalt wires that were slightly bigger, and we could really detect individual ones with this imaging as well. So we're going to start again looking at the platinum nickel nanowire data set. From top to bottom, this is the as synthesized, then annealed, acid leached, and reannealed samples. And we're looking at the nickel and oxygen chemistry. And we see right away qualitatively that there is a clear peak-shaped change with each of these different processing steps. And there's a few different nickel oxides that are likely present here. We see a small nickel metallic shoulder potentially, but this grows clearly after these different post-processing treatment steps. And we also see some of these nickel oxides decrease with especially acid leaching and reannealing conditions. In the oxygen data, we also see these changes in nickel oxide, especially after acid leaching, we kind of lose this metal oxide shoulder. And we also see in these kind of green lines the indication of a couple different organic species that are present at the surface as well. So now we can compare this to the HAXPES data, which is probing again up to 30 nanometers, 3 times deeper into the sample surface and subsurface. We start seeing more nickel metal in this red HAXPES spectrum in all of the materials. And we notice especially clearly in the annealed step that there's this significant trend towards almost all nickel metal, with a lot of these oxide species decreasing significantly. And some of those oxides come back after these other treatments, but we still see this really prominent nickel metal peak with the HAXPES data. So this is suggesting, again, that the nickel towards the surface detected with XPS is highly oxidized, but with the HAXPES beam, we're detecting more into that bulk nickel metal core. And I mentioned we can also use this technique for quantification. So we were able to quantify with XPS on the top table and then HAXPES on the bottom as a function of these different processing steps. In addition to the nickel and platinum, we see some carbon present. Generally, the carbon is much lower concentration with the HAXPES source, and this is one benefit of using this deeper source, that you're kind of seeing a little bit more into the true chemistry beneath any sort of surface contamination. We also see some differences in the carbon with post-processing steps, and we see a little bit of a trend where generally the acid-leached reannealed ones have slightly lower carbon at the surface, and especially acid-leached even in the subsurface. With the oxygen data, we see again that there is more towards the sample surface, which correlates with some of the spectral overlays we saw in the previous slide. And we still see some differences with the post-processing steps. Looking at the nickel and platinum data, we see generally that there is a change with the annealing process. We see slightly more in both the nickel, or both the XPS and HAXPES data, and then slightly less nickel once we acid leach and reanneal. And we see kind of the opposite trend, where we see more platinum at these later steps in both samples, but we also see slight differences in the relative amounts of these metals, where we're detecting a lot more nickel deeper into the sample with the HAXPES source. We did a similar comparison for the platinum nickel cobalt data set, and here we're looking at the nickel chemistry and cobalt chemistry with the as synthesized catalyst, and then compared to 2 samples that were directly acid leached and a sample that was annealed and then acid leached. So here we have slightly less nickel signal because, again, this is more a thin nickel surface coating. We do detect mainly nickel oxide present with this XPS source. There's not really a strong nickel metal signal with the XPS looking more at the surface. And looking at the cobalt chemistry, which is coming from that bulk cobalt core, these generally look a lot more similar for all of the different processing steps and are predominantly oxidized in the detection limit of the XPS technique. We can again look deeper into the sample with the HAXPES source, which is the red spectra, and here we are starting to see more nickel metal in the subsurface with all of these different post-processing steps, we do still see a bit of a change in the shape with processing, and generally we still see some nickel oxides present in all cases. With the cobalt data, with the HAXPES source, we do start to see some cobalt metal with the as-synthesized sample and the one that was annealed. But after acid leaching, the XPS and HAXPES data look quite similar, and we're really just seeing predominantly oxidized cobalt. Again, we can look at the quantification with these techniques, and we see kind of similar trends as before, where we have less carbon detected in certain samples with the HAXPES source. We see some differences in the carbon amounts with the post-processing steps. It looks like the annealing step does impact the amount of carbon that was detected, and these ones that did not have annealing, there was a much higher carbon concentration, both at the surface and subsurface after acid leaching. With the oxygen data, we see kind of more similar amounts for the as-synthesized sample at the surface and subsurface, but we see some changes with post-processing, again with these two acid leaching steps having some differences from this additional annealing step. And if we compare these three different metals, we generally see more cobalt detected with the chromium deeper into the sample than we do with the aluminum XPS source. We also see some changes in the cobalt that's detected. We have more cobalt present with both sources with the synthesized sample, and then once they are treated, we see slightly less cobalt. We also see differences in the platinum and nickel amounts. We're detecting generally more platinum with the chromium HAXPES source in the subsurface than we are with the XPS source, and with the XPS source we're detecting more nickel. So this suggests that there might be more nickel towards the surface, slightly more platinum and cobalt present in the subsurface. And again, we see changes with each of these different post-processing treatments. So we're kind of going to wrap up by looking at the trends in the nickel to platinum ratio that we got from each of these different techniques. So starting with HAXPES in this kind of dark blue color, which is our deepest sampling depth out of these four techniques. We see with annealing, we have an increase in the nickel to platinum ratio. So again, that means that the nickel from the nanowire core is kind of moving towards the surface, and or platinum is slightly moving towards the subsurface. So we ultimately are getting an increase in platinum, or an increase in nickel relative to platinum with this annealing step, which was designed to alloy the platinum and nickel together. And we had collected bulk X-ray absorption spectroscopy measurements to quantify that alloy. And we see a similar increase in the alloy when we have more nickel towards the surface. With acid leaching, our nickel to platinum ratio drops significantly, so we have a lot less nickel towards the surface, and then re-annealing kind of brings some of that back. XPS in this lighter blue color has generally a similar trend, but the two first samples are slightly more similar, more towards the surface with XPS. When we compare this with Auger data, which is in the dark green, so this is moving kind of slightly more surface sensitive, we see a slightly similar trend to XPS where the as-synthesized anneal samples are slightly similar. We have a decrease in this ratio with acid leaching, and then it increases slightly again after re-annealing. With TOF-SIMS, which is the most surface sensitive, we see a slightly different trend. So this is suggesting between these different techniques that we kind of have a different composition in the nickel and platinum amounts in chemistry at the very surface and the subsurface, and then kind of further down towards the bulk of the material. So in summary, this is one of the main reasons why it's very beneficial to use these different techniques and compare them, because by looking at the different kind of spot size and detection limits, we are able to kind of quantify how our chemistry looks at the more outermost surface as well as the subsurface. And specifically in this data set today, the Auger technique also showed us that we did have the nanowires remain intact even after the acid leaching removed the majority of the nickel or the cobalt. We did see some of them breaking up, but overall they still remained intact. We also were able to look at the distribution of nickel and platinum across the sample surface. We saw some small heterogeneities even on individual wires. With the TOF-SIMS data, we looked a little bit more closely at some of the surface contamination. We noticed that some of those species tracked more with the nanowire shape and distribution, but others were different, which told us a little bit about contamination of the wires themselves versus more external contamination. And we also saw, comparing the platinum nickel data set to the platinum nickel cobalt data set, that the platinum coating on the nickel nanowires was slightly more uniform than the nickel coating was on the cobalt nanowires. Going a little bit more deep into the sample with XPS and particularly HAXPES, we saw that there was a lot of oxidized nickel towards the surface, more platinum to the surface after acid leaching, and then we saw more metallic nickel the further that we analyzed deeper into the sample. And this was able to track with some of the results we saw from the bulk XAS technique that showed differences in the platinum nickel alloy content. And with that, I would like to thank you for your attention today.